U.S. Major Glenn Ignacio is a former U.S. Special Operations Air Force commander. Retired Colonel Simon Diggins is a former military and defense attaché in the Middle East for the British Armed Forces. They join us now to discuss what we can expect to see unfold. Gentlemen, it's nice to meet you both. Thank you so much for taking the time. Glenn Ignacio, I wonder if I can start with you. Israel has declared war on Hamas, has now called up its largest ever number of reservists in history. Is there any doubt in your mind that we will see a ground invasion in coming days?
I think there's no doubt that it's going to occur, especially since the situation that we have with the Air Force preparing the battlefield and taking out known sites. The next thing will have to be a very confused and a very troubling ground order of battle, because this is a very dense area. You know, the Gaza Strip's only 25 miles long by 7 miles wide at its largest area, and there's over 2.5 million people. So this is going to be military operations in urban terrain, very dangerous, very dirty.
Simon Diggins, if that is what happens, more than 100 soldiers and civilians at least have been taken hostage by Hamas. How does that complicate things for Israeli forces going into Gaza?
No, enormously. If you're trying to deal with hostages, even in a conflict situation, it's very difficult to try and find out where they are, where they've been moved to, and everything goes to that. So the commanders will have to take a very hard decision. Do they risk the life of the hostages in order to achieve a particular military objective, or will they just ignore them and carry on with the military objective? And that's a very difficult decision for people to make.
Glenn Ignacio, as you said, more than 2 million people live in there, right? And not every one of those is a Hamas militant, soldier, terrorist, whatever term you want to use to describe them. How does this happen without an enormous loss of civilian life?
Unfortunately, it can. I think that the best thing you can do is, as with any military operation, you do want to, eliminate or reduce the collateral damage. But as you mentioned before, and as your prior reporters stated, is everything is very close knit there. The streets are small. Everything is so dense. You can see that from the images, and you see that the airstrikes have had significant impacts on various buildings. The other thing is, as they mentioned, the tunnels. The ability for Hamas to be able to booby trap and set these really tricky traps for Israel, if they do, when they do this ground force, is going to be very dangerous for them. But unfortunately, as I say, the collateral damage, and as mentioned before, the hostages, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of people lost. But the idea of eliminating Hamas is really going to be the mainstream thought of Netanyahu and the IDF because of what just happened.
Simon Diggins, you share that assessment? When you look at the terrain and the geography and the buildings that are there, the entrenched defensive position, the potential for booby traps, civilians and hostages, do you share Glenn Ignacio's assessment of how violent this will be?
No, he's completely correct about what a direct assault would be on an urban area. It absorbs soldiers, absorbs troops. Even the most basic things like trying to get supplies and reinforcements in is difficult. Trying to take your casualty out is extremely difficult. And when you've still got the civilian population in place, you've always got them taken into account as well. The one option which has been discussed, which perhaps Glenn didn't bring out, is the option of siege. While we know that the whole area is very heavily populated, in fact, it's mostly broken into two very large areas, Gaza City itself, and further south, a town called Khan Yunis. And there is just a possibility what they go for is some kind of siege. That was sort of intimated by the Minister of Defense from Israel, who talked about turning off food, fuel, and even water into those areas. So it is just possible that what they might try to do is effectively establish a state of siege around the two major towns and major cities in the urban areas, and then take their time to sort out the Hamas militants over time. That is an option. There are risks attached to that sort of option as well, not least of which the issue around humanitarian catastrophe that might result from that. But the siege and the siege warfare is a very old, very established form of warfare, dealing with a large urban area you're not prepared to clear completely. And given the size of the population, and even with the very large mobilization the Israelis have got, and they're mobilizing some 360,000 from your reporter Paul earlier on, the total mobilizational strength is about 450. Even with all those numbers, I mean, trying to conduct an urban assault would be extremely difficult. A siege, on the other hand, has a certain kind of what you might call economy of effort about it. You can close this place down. You can't necessarily deal with all the problem all the time, but you gradually put like a stranglehold on people, and eventually options occur as a result of that because they run out of things, they have to move, they have to get resupplies, and then you can strike. So that is also an option, and it may be one of the options that Benjamin Netanyahu and the IDF are considering at the moment.
Glenn Ignazio, you talk about you hear about a siege is something you associate with like medieval warfare, right? Surrounding a castle and this sort of an approach. But Simon makes the point that there's more than 2 million people in there. They're already cutting off food and water and electricity and fuel going in. Could you reasonably do something like that without a humanitarian catastrophe that might turn the world against Israel in this moment?
Well, there's great points, and I would never close the door on any operation. And I agree with the colonel. The idea that Gaza has, the walls, you can literally contain Gaza the way it is, and they have shut off the water, fuel, and food. The confusing question about the ground order that we talked about is you got to remember it's not just the ground. These buildings are very tall, so it's a three-dimensional battle space because you have to think of everybody that's not just shooting at you, but shooting from top down and vice versa. That's why these city areas are very, very dangerous. But the thing that would happen is you would have to, if you were to starve the organization out, you'd have to have the Palestinians start pushing and turning against Hamas. Like I said, that's a possibility, but it's what's going to happen and what does the direction and decisions of Benjamin Netanyahu take, considering what they have to face. There will be significant losses on both sides. And that is something that they're not going to rush into and they're going to calculate perfectly before they execute it. But these are great ideas. I would never close the door on anything. Absolutely.
But Simon Diggins, I'm no expert on the Gaza Strip. I will confess that. But it seems to me when you're a militant organization like Hamas, you may have the capacity to get the food and get the water and get the supplies, even in short supply, that ordinary civilians wouldn't have the capacity to do. And the option you've outlined feels like it might move too slow for the political circumstances in Israel. I mean, what do you think is the most likely option that we're going to see in the next little while?
The most likely option is one that they're not going to lose all their people in some kind of assault. I mean, psychologically, this has been a huge blow to Israel, both in terms of its prestige and also just as your reporter so deftly portrayed, the sheer horror of the way in which Hamas conducted its barbaric operation against Israel means that there'll be some desire for revenge. What will probably be happening now is trying to contain that, direct that righteous anger against Hamas, but at the same time trying to work out how do we do this without losing a huge number more of Israeli soldiers, and also without inflicting massive Palestinian civilian casualties, and as you rightly point out, then turning, if you like, the court of world opinion against Israel. At the moment, rightly, it's on Israel's side. But on the other hand, it's turned into a sort of an operation of, if you like, the kind of Russian-style barbarity as they conduct in places like Grozny, that I think people would have a very different view. And that will be uppermost, I think, in Israeli minds.
Glenn Ignazio, you outlined some of the tactical challenges that a military invading force would have in a battlefield like Gaza. You're also not going up against a regular force where they are clearly identifiable in a uniform and you kind of know who is who. What sort of complications does that present for an operation like this where, again, going back to the innocents in there, that they just don't get slaughtered?
Well, you're absolutely right. Is to identify who's friend or foe, or just disseminate between who's the terrorist and who's not, is a tough situation. Everybody's dressed the same way, acting the same way. One person has an explosive vest, and the other person doesn't. That is the conflict, and you've probably seen it in the past where we were moving in Iraq and we've engaged in similar operations like that. So it's very dangerous of what Israel's about to embark on if they enter Gaza. So that's the question. And the other thing is the booby traps, that the tunnels and everything we've talked about, they could go past and all of a sudden they show up behind the IDF. It is a very complicated situation. I wanted to add on also what the colonel said, and he's absolutely right, is the warfare isn't just the physical and kinetic side, it's also the information warfare. And if the Hamas starts publicly on camera killing people and saying, we'll stop this when Israel stops, that's going to start really affecting people around the world. And the longer that it goes, the more detrimental it is to Israel. So they are facing a lot of things of not only the warfare and the engagement they're about to do, but also the timing of making sure you're not going to lose troops. But at the same time, you have to maintain that sentiment of driving forward. It's a trinity: the ability to carry it out militarily, the will of the troops, and the will of the people behind you. Without that trinity, it's very tough to be successful in this engagement.
Simon Diggins, just as a final point, what should we be watching for next in terms of giving us a clue of exactly what approach Israel may take in this?
I think there'll be two things going on. The first will be actual military movement on the ground, and then naturally they will maintain a high degree of operational security. So we may not necessarily see exactly what they're going to try and do from there. But I think what we might also see is some clear attempts to make sure that if you like, the context of this, the geopolitical context, is kept safe. Your reporter highlighted some of the challenges and some of the, at this stage, low-level engagement taking place on other parts of of Israel's borders. What Benjamin Netanyahu will not want to end up with, as happened in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, is where the main assault took place initially in Egypt, and then secondary assaults, which distracted a lot of Israeli attention, took place elsewhere. So there'll be a great effort to ensure that if they do decide to do something in Gaza, and whenever they decide to do it, that if you like, the security and the geopolitical context in the surrounding countries is also safe and secure for them. That will also be difficult. And there'll be no easy answers there either. So they really do have a significant strategic challenge ahead.
Gentlemen, I really appreciate you bringing your experience to this conversation for us. Retired Major Glenn Ignazio and retired Colonel Simon Diggins, thank you both for your time today.
Thank you.